All right, everybody. So we want to talk about fiscal policy today. And fiscal policy is probably one of the more key components that you need to be able to understand and articulate, especially when it comes to the AP exam, but also in regards to how it interacts in the real world economy. You will see examples of fiscal policy everywhere you go, no matter what channel you turn on. So in regards to fiscal policy, that's really defined as the government's use of tax and spending to achieve desired goals. So we're looking at achieving macro equilibrium, right? And we can do that through manipulation of your tax dollars or manipulation of government spending. And that's just the basic understanding of what fiscal policy is. So units 4, 5, and 6, like we've said before, are all kind of connected, right? So Unit 4, we focused on why recessions, depressions, contractions, and expansions happen, focusing on the impact of consumption and investment on those business cycles. Well, now that we have a pretty decent understanding of why these things occur, we are going to start to focus on how we can fix those problems. So Unit 5 focuses on how the government can work to fix a broken economy through manipulation of taxing and government spending and transfer payments. And that's what we'll be focusing on. But we do need to highlight that there are issues or costs to everything that the government does, right? Tinstoffel. There is no such thing as a free lunch, right? And we'll focus on some of those issues later on in this unit. And then next unit, we'll take a look at how central banks like the Federal Reserve can manipulate monetary policy in order to achieve those same goals. Now, a lot of times monetary policy and fiscal policy will work together, but sometimes they will work in contraction to one another, because a couple key components here is you have government controlling fiscal policy, government meaning politicians, and monetary policy controlled by central bankers, non-elected appointed officials, right? So you have conflicting goals between those two, and sometimes they work together and sometimes they worked in conflict. So Unit 5 and 6 focus on demand side stabilization, meaning that when looking at the macroeconomy, right, we have our aggregate demand, we have our short run aggregate supply, we have our long run aggregate supply. Well, at this particular equilibrium point, there's your price level, there's your output, we have a recession, right? So you could fix this one of two ways. You could instigate some sort of rightward shift of the supply curve, right? So classical economists thinking we can increase the supply to boost the demand, whereas fiscal policy is mainly focused on moving aggregate demand. And so then you would get back to that macro equilibrium. So fiscal policy is very much in the school of Keynes, Keynesian economics, right? So Keynes is the Great Depression era. He saw that the classical economists may have been wrong because you had sticky wages, sticky prices. And so he advocated for doing something to stimulate aggregate demand, to boost it, and to push us back towards our long-run goal. So, a couple things here. Again, it's all about promoting short-run equilibrium to be as near to full employment as possible, right? So again, we're operating currently in our economy at or near full employment, but that might be here, that might be here, that might be here, right? So the goal of our fiscal policy is to get us to as close to this point as possible, right? But at the same time, we want to make sure that the price levels are stable, right? Because as you move your aggregate demand curve, we know that's usually characterized by a relatively large increase in price level. And so we want to maintain our price stability, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the natural forces of the business cycle still play a role. Right? You can't really eliminate the business cycle like we've talked about. It's natural. But one other consideration that we try to look at when we're looking at demand side policies is not hampering long-run growth. And so we'll talk about how the government can influence the aggregate demand curve through taxes and spending, but a cost to that may be a decrease in our long-run growth. And so ways to make sure that these policies are getting us where we want to be in the short term while not sacrificing where we want to go in the long term. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we have three levers or tools that we use to close this gap, right? So obviously the first one would be government spending, right? Now government spending is anything that would be counted in your real GDP government. So public goods, Mr. Trump's favorite thing, infrastructure, and any other domestic projects that directly contribute to the total demand for output, right? So a good war would be an example, right? So World War II was a great example of not necessarily not for economic purposes, but that was kind of the trade-off there. Was World War II helped boost our economy, as we know, get us out of the Great Depression. The second tool would be our tax policy, right? And tax policy is all focused upon implementing or changing our disposable income, right? Because if your disposable income increases, that's going to lead to an increase in consumption. And we know consumption is the key driver of our real GDP. And so if we can get this sucker to move, then we can get this sucker to move. Characterizing that by a rightward shift of our aggregate demand, right? Achieving that goal. But we can also influence our disposable income through a third tool, and that would be the use of transfer payments. So remember, transfer payments we usually do not calculate into our real GDP, right? Because the money, the tax dollars that are being collected from you they're already represented in your consumption. So when they're given to Bob and Bob gets them, he's not doing any production to receive that wage, so we don't calculate it in real GDP. But in this case, we need to talk about these because if we increase our transfer payments, so our unemployment, our food stamps, and all of those tools that we've talked about before, it's targeting the same component, right? It's still targeting your disposable income, right? If you lose your job and you don't have unemployment insurance or food stamps, your disposable income is going to go down to nearly zero. But if you qualify for unemployment and you qualify for food stamps, then maybe your disposable income will at least stay constant, or maybe it will tick up a bit, which then will hopefully tick up consumption and then again tick up your real GDP, propping this up. Now, there are some people that have issues with this economic theory, and we'll talk about those when we start talking about supply side economics, Reaganomics, and some of the pitfalls and issues with fiscal policy, but that's the basic understanding, right? It's fiscal policy is targeting consumption and government spending to achieve our macro equilibrium outcomes. So we need to talk about how much money we need to either spend or to tax in order to achieve these things. Well, we want to talk about the idea of a multiplier. So a multiplier is the idea that for every dollar that goes into the economy, it doesn't have a singular impact. Meaning, if I put $1 into the economy, it does, at the end of the day, when it finally gets deposited in the bank, it may actually have traded hands 6 or 7 times And so at the end of the day, that $1 has had a macro impact of, let's say, $8. Right? You get paid a wage, you take that wage and you go buy a Slurpee with it, and then a portion of that profits from that Slurpee go to buying groceries at the store, and a portion of the profits from the grocery store go to paying somebody else's wage. And that cyclical nature of the economy, that circular flow, right, allows for smaller amounts of money to be spent to have larger impacts in the greater economy. So there are different multipliers for different tools. So when we start talking about just injections into the economy, meaning government spending or investment spending, we're going to characterize these as direct injections, meaning all of the money that goes in circulates through the economy. And so to find what the simple spending multiplier would be, you're going to take your MPC as your denominator. Oh boy, that's math words, right? And if you take 1 over 1 minus your MPC, or 1 over your MPS, it's going to give you the multiplier, meaning how many times will this dollar circulate through the economy before it's finished. So this is important for determining government spending or changes in investment, and we'll do some examples later. But we need to talk about tax multiplier as well. So the tax multiplier is slightly different. So in this case, the tax multiplier is going to be what I'm going to call an indirect injection. Now, why is it indirect? Well, because a certain portion of your disposable income, as we know because we've looked at our MPS and our MPC, goes to not into consumption but into savings. So an initial change of, let's say, $100 billion injected into the economy here will not have the same impact as a $100 billion tax cut, because a portion of this $100 billion will go towards savings, whereas $100 billion of government spending goes directly into the economy. So in order to find that, you can do some complicated math, 1 over 1 minus the MPC divided by X, whatever, or you can just know that the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the simple spending multiplier, right? So I could go through the math, or you could just know the SSM minus 1 equals your tax multiplier. Now, the same case is to be said for our transfer payments, right? Because again, it has both of these things deal with disposable income, and disposable income is up to you, and there is choice in that matter. And anytime there is choice for the consumer, you have 2 choices, right? You can consume or save. So the MPC makes this indeterminate here. So for both the taxes and our transfer payment changes, you're going to use the tax multiplier. With these last 2 multipliers, we'll talk more about later on in the unit, the balanced budget multiplier, talking about what governments can do and how we can balance our budgets, and then the money multiplier, which deals with our changes in money supply and the monetary policy. So we'll talk more about these in Unit 6. So here is a very simple table for you to look at, and again, it might be worth memorizing these, but they're all your most common MPCs that you will see in most problems used in macro. And there you will see the simple spending multiplier, then the tax multiplier, right? So if you have an MPC of 0.5, which means for every additional dollar in your disposable income, you spend 50 cents of it, that means that that dollar would have a multiplied impact of $2 in the economy. And notice how when the MPC increases, so does your simple spender. Also notice that the tax multiplier is 1 less than the simple spending multiplier. Also notice that the balanced budget multiplier is always 1. That's important. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we use these tools to close these gaps. So when we talk about this, we want to talk about expansionary policy, or policies that are aimed at expanding the economy, typical during times of recession. And we have policies that are contractionary, or policies that are characterized by inflationary gaps. So in this case, if we wanted to take a look at government spending as the tool we're going to use, obviously we're going to increase our government spending. If we increase our government spending, then that should have an increase in your real GDP, which should then have an increase in your aggregate demand. If we wanted to use tax policy to change that, we would want to cut your taxes, cut taxes across the board for all taxpayers, right? Because if you cut taxes, then that's going to increase your disposable income. Increase in disposable income should increase your consumption, which should increase your real GDP, which should increase your aggregate demand. And now the final tool would be increasing transfer payments, right? So transfer payments are going to do essentially the same thing here. If you increase transfer payments, Social Security, welfare, food stamps, all of those things, again, increase in disposable income, increase in consumption, increase in real GDP, increase in aggregate demand. And then flip everything around for inflation, right? So if we have an inflationary gap, government spending gets cut, decreases your real GDP, which should bring you back towards equilibrium. You want to raise taxes, get disposable income out of the hands of consumers so that they can't consume as much, which decreases real GDP, which decreases aggregate demand. Same thing with transfer payments, right? So this is all about disposable income and consumption and aggregate demand, right? So these are things that we talked about in Unit 4, but now we're adding that context to it in order to see why that stuff that we talked about last unit matters here. So at the end of the day here, fiscal policy are tools that are used counter-cyclically, meaning that we're using them to go against the current business cycle, right? So if this is our business cycle and we're in a contractionary period, right? This is where we are. Fiscal policy is attempting to push us back up, right? It's trying to go against that current, right? So in expansionary periods, though, you have inflation becomes an enemy, right? So if we're in an expansionary period characterized here, right, we know that price levels should be increasing. So fiscal policy can be used to try and mitigate some of those issues. And then in a contractionary period, we know that unemployment is the main issue. And so we can use fiscal policy here, so expansionary fiscal policy, to attempt to mitigate the issues that are characterized here. So, final point here. Fiscal policy is not a win-win scenario. There's always something that we have to give up. So in this case, using fiscal policy, it's going to change our output, right? So if we're using increased government spending or transfer payments, then people are going to be consuming differently than they were before, right? This at times tends to grow the size of government, right? Think of some of the major policies of the last 70 years, right? The New Deal, right? The Great Society, Obamacare, right? All of these things are versions of fiscal policy, and they have all grown the size of the government, and with that comes their own issues and challenges. Also remember that this is political, so this is politicians, not economists necessarily making these decisions. And so with that comes some less than enlightened economic decisions. And one of the big issues is the idea of debts and deficits, right? Because in expansionary fiscal policy, we're cutting taxation, yet we're supposed to increase our government spending. So that's essentially like your parents getting a pay cut at work, but then going out and buying a new yacht. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to force them into a deficit and then long-run debts, right? And so we're going to address all these different issues throughout this next unit. But I think this is a good point to stop and kind of just reflect on a couple of the things that we talked in here and maybe try out some problems.